White woman calls police on black kid, speechless when his mom, the governor arrives. Jamal was just 12 years old, a boy full of energy and dreams, who loved nothing more than playing basketball after school. That afternoon, the sky was clear and the warm sun made the walk home from school feel easy and pleasant. He carried his backpack, which was a little heavy with books, and bounced his worn-out basketball with his other hand as he walked through the quiet neighborhood. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, bright flowers in front yards, and trimmed green lawns. Birds were chirping, and the sound of children playing in the distance gave the whole neighborhood a calm feeling. Jamal often walked this way, cutting through the neighborhood because it was the shortest path back home. He wasn't thinking of much, just humming a tune he had learned in school, when his shoelace suddenly came undone. He stopped near the sidewalk, right in front of a white-painted house with tall windows and a neat garden. Jamal bent down, resting his basketball on the ground, and carefully tied his laces. He had learned from his mom to double knot them so they wouldn't come undone while walking. He smiled to himself, remembering how his mom, who was always busy, still made time to teach him small things like tying shoes properly. What Jamal didn't know was that behind one of those tall windows, someone was watching him. The woman who lived there, Mrs. Karen, had just finished making her afternoon tea. She glanced outside and saw Jamal standing there. At first, she didn't notice much, but as she looked longer, her thoughts began to change. She saw a boy with a backpack bending near her house and, instead of assuming he was just passing by, her mind began to fill with doubts. Why is he standing here? Why is he stopping in front of my house? She whispered to herself, her heart beating a little faster. She had lived in the neighborhood for years and often believed she knew who belonged there and who didn't. To her, Jamal seemed out of place. She didn't see a child tying his shoelace. She saw something else, something she imagined, not reality. Jamal, completely unaware of the suspicious eyes on him, picked up his basketball and started to dribble it lightly. He smiled at the sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement. He thought about how he would ask his friend Marcus to play later, maybe shoot hoops at the park before it got dark. His mind was full of simple joys, not knowing how quickly his day was about to change. Inside the house, Karen grew more anxious. She convinced herself that Jamal was looking around too much, maybe planning something. "This doesn't look right," she muttered. Without thinking twice, she picked up her phone and dialed the local police station. Her voice was calm at first, but then it grew tense as she spoke. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious," she said. "There's a boy outside my house. He's been standing here, looking around. I think he might be planning to break in." The officer on the other side took her words seriously. They promised to send a patrol car to check things out. Karen felt relieved, as if she had done her duty to keep her neighborhood safe. She didn't think about whether she might be wrong. She didn't stop to consider that the boy was just a child, doing nothing more than fixing his shoelace. Jamal continued walking slowly, dribbling his ball and enjoying the quiet. But soon, the faint sound of a car engine approached from behind. At first, he thought nothing of it. Cars came and went on this road all the time. But this one slowed down, and Jamal turned his head slightly to see a police car rolling up beside him. His steps grew slower. He felt a strange uneasiness in his chest. Why were they slowing down? Why were the officers looking at him like that? The patrol car came to a stop, and the doors opened. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms neat and their expressions serious. Jamal froze for a moment, his basketball slipping slightly from his grip before he caught it again. "Hey, son," one of the officers called out. "What are you doing here?" Jamal blinked, not sure what to say. I'm just walking home," he answered quietly, his voice polite but filled with confusion. The second officer glanced at his partner, then back at Jamal. "Where do you live?" Why are you standing near this house? Jamal felt his face grow warm. He pointed down the road. I live just a few streets away. I stopped to tie my shoelace, that's all. The officers looked at him, still suspicious. Before Jamal could explain further, the front door of the white-painted house swung open, and Karen stepped out. She crossed her arms and pointed directly at Jamal. That's him, she said firmly. That's the boy I told you about. He was standing right here, looking around. I didn't feel safe. Jamal's eyes widened. He wanted to speak up, to say she was wrong, but his throat felt tight. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. All he did was tie his shoe. Now this woman was accusing him of something he hadn't even thought of doing. The officers frowned. They didn't raise their voices, but their presence made Jamal feel small and powerless. He glanced down at his basketball, wishing he could just run away and disappear, but he knew that wasn't an option. He had seen enough stories on the news to know that running would only make things worse. One of the officers sighed and reached for his radio, quietly calling in a status update. Jamal stood still, his backpack weighing on his shoulders, his heart pounding faster with every second. He thought about his mom and how she always told him to stay calm and respectful if he was ever questioned by authority. Never forget who you are, she always reminded him. He tried to breathe deeply, but fear had already crept into his chest. His simple walk home from school had suddenly turned into something far more serious, and Jamal could not understand why. All he knew was that a stranger's words had placed him in a situation he never asked for. The neighborhood, once quiet, seemed to grow heavier. Curtains moved slightly as neighbors peeked out from their windows, watching the scene unfold. Jamal stood there, his hands trembling slightly, caught in the middle of something he didn't deserve, wishing anyone would believe him. And in that moment, as the officers waited for backup and Karen stood with her arms crossed, Jamal realized that what had started as a simple walk home was about to change his day, his trust, and maybe even the way he saw the world forever. The silence on the street grew heavier as Jamal stood frozen, the basketball tucked against his hip, his eyes darting between the two officers and the woman who had called them. He could still hear the faint buzz of the officer's radio as one of them spoke into it, his tone short and firm. Jamal tried not to let the fear on his face show, but the tightness in his throat made it difficult to even swallow. One officer, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped closer. His boots crunched lightly against the pavement as he stopped in front of Jamal. "What's your name, son?" he asked. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, gripping the strap of his backpack. "Jamal," he said softly. "Jamal what?" the officer pressed. "Jamal Thompson," the boy replied, his voice steady but quiet. "And where exactly do you live?" the officer continued, his gaze steady and searching, as if waiting for Jamal to slip up. "Just down Maple Street," Jamal explained, pointing in the direction he always walked home. "It's only a few blocks from here." The second officer, slightly older and with softer features, looked at Jamal curiously. "Do you have any ID?" he asked. Jamal frowned, confused. "I'm 12, he said. "I don't have an ID." The first officer raised an eyebrow, as if unimpressed by the answer. He glanced back at Karen, who stood near her porch, arms folded tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked proud of herself, as if she had caught someone doing something wrong. "Yes, that's him," she said again, louder this time. "He was standing here for a long time, looking around. I know when something isn't right. He was up to no good." Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to shout, to explain that he had only been tying his shoelace, but the serious faces in front of him made him doubt whether anyone would even believe him. The older officer crouched slightly, trying to meet Jamal's eyes. "Look, kid, we just need to make sure everything is okay here. Do your parents know where you are? Yes, sir, Jamal answered quickly. I was walking home from school. I always go this way. The officer nodded, but his partner didn't look satisfied. The tall officer stepped aside and muttered something into his radio again, calling for another unit. The faint static-filled response confirmed that backup was on its way. Jamal's chest tightened. He thought about his mom and how she always told him to stay calm, but the sight of another patrol car possibly coming made him feel like things were getting worse. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet here he was, being treated like he had done something terrible. As he stood there, Karen walked closer, keeping her distance but making sure her voice carried. "Officers, I've seen this before," she said, her tone full of certainty. "Kids hanging around, pretending to just be walking. Next thing you know, there are break-ins. I wasn't going to just sit by and watch." Jamal's face burned with embarrassment. He felt the weight of her words pressing down on him like a stone. He glanced around and noticed neighbors peeking from behind curtains, some even stepping onto their porches to see what was happening. He felt exposed, like the whole world was judging him for something he hadn't done. The older officer looked back at Karen. "Ma'am, we'll handle it," he said calmly, but his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. Something about Jamal didn't fit the picture she was painting. Still, the situation dragged on. The tall officer looked down at Jamal again. "Do you have a phone, Jamal? Can you call your parents?" Jamal shook his head. "My phone's at home. It died earlier," he said honestly. The officer's expression didn't change. He tapped his pen against his notebook, scribbling something down as if Jamal's simple answers needed to be recorded like evidence. The minutes felt like hours. Jamal's palms grew sweaty as he clutched his basketball tighter. He thought about how his mom always told him to keep his head high, to never let anyone make him feel less than he was. But standing there, under the sharp eyes of strangers and the accusing finger of Karen, it was hard to remember those lessons. Finally, the faint sound of another engine reached his ears. A second patrol car slowly turned onto the street, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Jamal's stomach dropped. He wished he could vanish, wished he had taken a different road home. The second car stopped, and another officer stepped out, glancing at the scene with a questioning look. He walked over to the first two officers and listened as they explained quickly. His eyes then landed on Jamal, who stood silently, hugging his basketball like it was a shield. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked. "Possible trespass or loitering," the tall officer explained. "Resident here felt unsafe. We're checking it out." The new officer studied Jamal for a long moment, his gaze softer than the others. He saw a boy in a school uniform, a backpack too heavy for his small frame, and a basketball scuffed from too many games on rough concrete. He didn't see a threat. Jamal looked up at him, meeting his eyes for just a second, hoping someone would finally understand. Before the officer could say much, Karen spoke again. "I know what I saw," she insisted. "You can't just let him walk away. He was standing right here, and I know he was thinking about doing something wrong." Jamal's lip trembled. He clenched his jaw, trying not to cry, but the unfairness of it all was overwhelming. He wanted to shout the truth, but he stayed quiet, remembering his mother's words about staying calm. The second officer crouched slightly, speaking to Jamal directly. "Hey, buddy. Did you just get out of school?" "Yes, sir," Jamal whispered. "And you were heading home?" "Yes, sir," Jamal nodded. "I live with my mom down the street." The officer gave a small sigh, then looked at his partners. "He looks like a kid heading home to me," he said plainly. The tall officer crossed his arms. "We still need to confirm." Jamal's heart pounded as he realized they weren't letting him go yet. He wished desperately that his mom were there. She always knew what to say, how to fix things. Right now, he felt too small, too powerless to make them see the truth. The older officer glanced at his watch, then at Jamal. Is there someone we can call? A parent, a guardian? Someone who can come here. Jamal hesitated, then nodded slowly. My mom. But she's busy, he said softly. She works a lot. Where does she work? The officer asked casually. Jamal looked down at his shoes, thinking of the right words. She works at the state office, he said carefully. She's really busy. I don't want to bother her. The officers exchanged a look, not fully understanding what Jamal meant. To them, it sounded like an ordinary office job. To Jamal, it meant something much more. The second officer finally straightened up, giving Jamal a small, almost reassuring nod. But the tension remained. Karen was still standing proudly, convinced she had done the right thing. The officers were still doubtful, still holding Jamal in place as though he had done something wrong. And Jamal, standing alone with his basketball, felt the weight of every stare, every doubt, every assumption pressing down on him. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this painful wait for someone to believe him was about to change completely when the person he longed for most finally arrived. Jamal stood in silence, his small frame tense, his basketball pressed tightly against his side as if it could somehow protect him. The officers were still around him, their questions circling back and forth, while Karen stood by her porch, her arms crossed with an expression of satisfaction. The neighborhood, once quiet, now felt like a stage where every eye was on him. He had never felt so out of place in a street he walked almost every day. The second officer, the one who seemed a little kinder, was just about to ask Jamal another question when the low hum of an engine came from the end of the block. At first, it sounded like any other car, but this one was different. It moved smoothly, slowing as it approached. A black SUV rolled up the street, its glossy paint reflecting the afternoon sun. Jamal's heart skipped a beat the moment he recognized it. He knew that car anywhere. Relief washed over him like a wave. He didn't even need to see who was inside, he already knew. His mom. The SUV stopped a short distance away, and the doors opened. Out stepped Alicia Thompson, Jamal's mother, her presence commanding attention without her saying a single word. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her posture tall and strong, every step she took carrying the confidence of a woman who had faced challenges much bigger than this one. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement as she walked toward the group. The officers turned, surprise flickering across their faces. Neighbors who had been peeking from behind curtains now pulled them wider, whispering as they recognized her. For this wasn't just Jamal's mother. This was Governor Alicia Thompson, the first black woman to ever hold the office in their state, a leader respected by many, admired for her intelligence, her strength, and her unshakable belief in justice. Jamal's lips trembled with both relief and emotion. He clutched his basketball and ran forward a few steps, meeting her halfway. The moment he reached her side, she placed a protective hand on his shoulder. Her eyes softened as she looked at him, but when she raised them to the officers, they were sharp, steady, and full of authority. "What's going on here?" she asked firmly, her voice calm but carrying weight. The tall officer, the one who had been the most suspicious, shifted uncomfortably. "Governor Thompson," he said quickly, clearly caught off guard. "We were just responding to a call from a resident. There was a report of suspicious behavior." "Suspicious behavior," she repeated, her tone clipped. She glanced at her son, then back at the officer. "You're telling me my 12-year-old son, walking home from school, is now a suspect in your eyes?" The officers exchanged uneasy looks. Karen, who had been standing confidently, suddenly looked less certain. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the boy's mother to be someone important, someone powerful. Karen cleared her throat, trying to step in. "Governor, I didn't know he was your son. I only saw him standing outside my house for too long. I was worried. You can understand that, right? I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." Alicia turned her gaze on Karen, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Safe from what?" "From a child tying his shoelace," she asked. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a sharp edge that made Karen take a small step back. The neighbors who had gathered nearby stayed quiet, their eyes darting between the governor, the officers, and Karen. The air was heavy with tension, yet it was clear that the balance of power had shifted the moment Alicia Thompson arrived. She turned back to the officers. "Do you realize the kind of danger my son was just put in because someone made an assumption about him?" she asked. Her tone was calm, but every word cut deep. How quickly something like this could have escalated. The older officer, the one who had tried to be gentler with Jamal, looked down, ashamed. He knew she was right. The tall officer tried to keep his composure, but even he couldn't ignore the truth in her words. Jamal stood close to his mother, his shoulders relaxing slightly now that she was there. He felt safe again, like the storm he had been caught in was finally breaking apart. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. His mother was speaking for him, protecting him in a way only she could. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to struggle with her own thoughts. She tried to explain again. I wasn't trying to target him. I just saw something that looked unusual. Anyone would have done the same. Would they?" Alicia asked calmly, tilting her head. "Or did you see something unusual because of what he looks like, not because of what he was actually doing?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. She had no answer. For the first time since this all began, she looked uncertain, her confidence shrinking as the weight of her mistake began to sink in. The governor's voice softened just a little as she looked back at the officers. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Every unnecessary stop, every false assumption, chips away at the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. My son is a child. He should be able to walk home with a basketball in his hand without being treated like a threat." The second officer nodded, his face serious. "You're right, Governor," he admitted quietly. I I don't think we handled this the way we should have." The tall officer gave a short nod as well, though reluctantly. "We were just doing our job," he muttered, but the firmness in his tone had softened. Alicia looked down at Jamal and gently brushed her hand over his shoulder. She crouched slightly, so she was at his level, and whispered just for him to hear, "You did the right thing by staying calm. I'm proud of you." Jamal's eyes stung with tears he had been holding back. He nodded quickly, gripping the basketball tighter. Having her there gave him strength, and the words she spoke reminded him of his own worth. Standing again, Alicia turned back to Karen. Her voice was steady, not cruel, but it carried truth that couldn't be ignored. "You thought you were protecting your neighborhood. But what you really did was put a child at risk because of an assumption. Next time, think before you act. Look at what really happened, not just what you imagine." Karen swallowed hard, her face pale. She wanted to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, she realized how her quick judgment had spiraled into something much bigger than she could handle. The silence on the street stretched for a moment. Then, Alicia placed her arm gently around Jamal and began walking him toward the SUV. The officers stood back, unsure of what else to say, while the neighbors watched in complete silence. Jamal glanced back once as he walked, his eyes meeting Karen's. He didn't feel angry, just tired and confused. He was only 12. He didn't understand why someone had to see him as something he wasn't. But he knew one thing for certain: his mother had turned what could have been his scariest moment into a reminder of his own dignity and worth. As they reached the SUV, Alicia opened the door for him and helped him inside. She gave the officers one last look, calm yet unyielding, before stepping in herself. The car door closed, the engine started, and slowly, they pulled away from the street, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any words. For the people who had watched, for the officers who had questioned, and especially for Karen, the moment would not be forgotten. And for Jamal, though he was still shaken, he knew he was not alone. His mother's presence had changed everything. The black SUV had barely rolled down the street when the weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air. Neighbors who had peeked out from their windows lingered on their porches, whispering in hushed tones about what they had seen. The officers remained in place, their shoulders tense, their eyes downcast as they quietly considered the events that had just unfolded. But Alicia Thompson, even as she sat in the car with her son, knew the matter was far from over. She could not simply drive away and pretend it hadn't happened. She owed it to her son, and to every child like him, to face the moment directly. She looked over at Jamal, who sat in the back seat holding his basketball tightly, staring at his shoes. His silence spoke volumes. The way his shoulders slumped, the way he avoided her eyes, it showed her how deeply the encounter had affected him. She reached across and gently touched his hand. "Stay here, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'll handle this." Jamal looked up quickly, worry flickering in his eyes. "Mom, you don't have to. Let's just go home." Alicia gave him a warm, reassuring smile. "I know you want to forget this, but sometimes we have to face things, not just for ourselves, but so they don't happen again. Trust me, okay?" Jamal hesitated, then nodded, his small fingers tightening around the ball as if it was the only thing grounding him. With a steady breath, Alicia stepped back out of the SUV. The air was still heavy with tension, but she walked calmly, every step purposeful. Neighbors fell silent as she approached the officers again. Karen stood stiffly near her porch, her arms no longer folded but hanging uncertainly at her sides. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she could fade into the background. Alicia stopped in front of the group, her posture straight and her eyes calm yet unyielding. The officers turned to her, unsure of what she would say next. "I want to make something clear," Alicia began, her voice strong but steady. "My son was walking home from school. He wasn't breaking any laws. He wasn't trespassing. He was a child tying his shoelace, and yet he was treated as though he was a threat. Tell me, how does that make sense?" The older officer lowered his head, his hands fidgeting slightly at his sides. The tall officer, however, tried to maintain a professional stance. "Governor, we were responding to a resident's concern. We had to take it seriously." "Taking something seriously," Alicia replied firmly, "does not mean acting on it without thinking. You saw a 12-year-old boy with a backpack and a basketball. You had a choice to see him for who he really is, and instead, you treated him like a suspect." Her words were clear and sharp, and though she never raised her voice, they struck harder than shouting ever could. Karen, who had been quiet until now, took a step forward, trying to defend herself. "I didn't know he was your son. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I was just protecting my home. You can't blame me for being careful." Alicia turned toward her, her eyes steady. "This isn't about him being my son. It's about him being a child. You saw a boy standing outside and assumed the worst. Why? What was he doing that made you feel unsafe? He wasn't breaking your window. He wasn't knocking on your door. He wasn't even in your yard. He was on the sidewalk tying his shoe. What exactly was dangerous about that?" Karen opened her mouth but couldn't answer. The truth of the governor's words hung in the air. Her earlier certainty wavered, her cheeks flushing as her excuses began to crumble. The neighbors shifted uneasily, some looking at Karen with disapproval, others nodding slightly as if silently agreeing with Alicia's words. The officers remained quiet, knowing it wasn't their place to interrupt. Alicia continued, her voice carrying both strength and grace. Do you know how quickly these situations can turn into tragedies? Do you know how many children like my son have been put in danger simply because someone chose to assume instead of observe? She paused, her eyes sweeping over the faces watching her. Every call like this matters. Every mistaken suspicion carries weight. And every child deserves to walk home without being treated like a criminal. The tall officer cleared his throat. Governor, with all due respect, we were only doing our duty. We didn't mean any harm. Alicia looked directly at him. Doing your duty means protecting people, not putting them at risk because of assumptions. Harm doesn't only come from physical actions. It comes from the fear, the humiliation, the sense of being treated as less than you are. My son stood here terrified, not because of what he did, but because of how he was seen. Her words silenced him. He shifted his stance, no longer able to hold her gaze. Karen took another step forward, her voice quieter now. I really thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You may not have meant it, Alicia replied gently but firmly, but intent is not the same as impact. You may have thought you were protecting, but instead, you harmed. And the harm you caused isn't erased just because you didn't mean it. Karen's eyes dropped to the ground. Her earlier confidence had dissolved completely, replaced with the uncomfortable truth of what she had done. For a long moment, no one spoke. The quiet hum of the late afternoon filled the silence, the distant sound of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The neighborhood that had once felt peaceful now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Finally, the older officer spoke softly. Governor, you're right. We should have approached this differently. We should have looked closer before assuming. I apologize. His words were sincere, his tone heavy with regret. Alicia gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, then looked back at the others. Apologies matter, but what matters more is learning. Next time you see a child like my son, I hope you'll see him for who he is, not for who you imagine him to be. The tall officer gave a short nod, his earlier firmness now replaced with quiet understanding. Even Karen, who had been the most defensive, stood in silence, unable to deny the truth any longer. As Alicia turned to leave, she caught sight of Jamal watching from the SUV window. His eyes were wide, filled with a mix of pride and relief. She smiled at him, a smile that carried reassurance, then turned back briefly to address the crowd. We all want safe communities, she said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. But safety doesn't come from suspicion. It comes from understanding, from trust, from seeing each other as human beings. That is the lesson I hope we all take from today. With that, she walked back to the SUV, her steps as steady and confident as when she had first arrived. The neighbors slowly retreated back into their homes, whispers fading. The officers stood quietly, thoughtful, while Karen remained on her porch, speechless, her arms now hanging loosely at her sides. As Alicia got back into the car, Jamal leaned against her shoulder, his basketball still in his lap. Mom, he whispered, you weren't scared at all. She smiled softly and kissed the top of his head. Of course I was, she admitted gently. But sometimes we have to face fear with courage. That's how change happens. Jamal nodded, his eyes shining with admiration. In that moment, he realized that his mother wasn't just his protector, she was a leader, not only for the state but for him personally. And though the day had been frightening, it had also shown him the power of truth, dignity, and standing up for what was right. As the SUV pulled away once more, Jamal looked out the window at the street they left behind. It no longer felt like just a street in a quiet neighborhood. It felt like the place where a lesson had been planted, one that would echo far beyond the trimmed lawns and tidy houses. The ride home was quiet at first. Jamal sat in the back seat of the SUV, his basketball resting on his lap, his small hands moving over its rough surface again and again. He stared out the window, watching the trees and houses pass by, but his mind was still stuck on what had just happened. His mom drove steadily, her face calm but thoughtful. She glanced at him every so often in the rearview mirror, seeing the way his eyes seemed distant. After a few minutes, Alicia spoke softly. "You know, Jamal, none of this was your fault." Jamal blinked and looked at her through the mirror. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "But she said I was suspicious. The police, they didn't believe me." Alicia's heart ached at his words, but she kept her tone gentle. "People will sometimes see what they expect to see, not what's really in front of them. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You were just being you, walking home, carrying your ball. That's all that matters." Jamal nodded slowly, but the heaviness didn't leave him completely. He leaned his head against the window, watching the familiar streets of their neighborhood appear. By the time they reached home, the sky had begun to glow with the golden shades of early evening. As they walked inside, Jamal dropped his backpack near the door and set his basketball on the couch. He sat quietly, his shoulders still heavy. Alicia sat down beside him and placed her arm around him. "Do you know why I spoke up out there?" she asked. Jamal looked at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Because you're the governor." She smiled gently. "Not just because I'm the governor. I spoke up because I'm your mom. Because you deserve to be seen for who you are. And because if I don't speak now, then the same thing might happen again, not just to you, but to other kids too." Her words seemed to ease some of the weight on Jamal's heart. He leaned against her, comforted by the strength he felt in her presence. Later that night, while Jamal did his homework, Alicia sat at her desk and thought about the day. She knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened in their community, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. But what happened today was different. People had seen it with their own eyes. Neighbors had watched. Officers had been present. And most importantly, Jamal had been directly affected. She couldn't allow the moment to pass quietly. The next morning, the story had already begun to spread. A neighbor who had filmed parts of the incident shared it online, and within hours, it was being talked about across social media. The video showed Jamal standing nervously with his basketball while officers questioned him, and then his mother arriving, stepping forward with calm authority. The clip of her asking, "Save from what?" From a child tying his shoelace, was repeated again and again. Reporters began reaching out. Headlines appeared: "Governor's son questioned by police after neighbor calls 911. Some focused on Alicia's role as governor, while others highlighted Jamal's innocence and the dangers of assumptions. At school, Jamal noticed kids whispering about it. Some classmates came up to him, saying they had seen the video. A few looked at him differently, as if they finally realized the kinds of things he had to deal with. Jamal wasn't sure how to feel. He didn't like being the center of attention, but he understood that people were learning something important from what happened. A few days later, Alicia decided to address the matter publicly. She stood at a podium in the state capitol, cameras flashing, microphones in front of her. Jamal wasn't there. She wanted to protect him from the spotlight, but she spoke on his behalf and on behalf of every child who had been judged unfairly. "My son is 12 years old," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "He was walking home from school with a backpack and a basketball. And yet, in the eyes of someone who didn't know him, he became a threat. This is not just about my family. This is about every child who deserves to walk home safely, without fear of being misjudged or misunderstood." The room was silent, every ear tuned to her words. She continued, "We cannot build safe communities on fear and suspicion. Safety comes from trust, from fairness, and from seeing each other with open eyes and open hearts. I hope this incident reminds us all to look closer, to think before we assume, and to remember the humanity in every person we see." Her words were shared widely, printed in newspapers, replayed on television, and posted online. Many praised her for turning a painful moment into a powerful message. Meanwhile, Jamal continued with his life school, basketball, spending time with friends, but he carried the experience with him. Sometimes he would think back to that afternoon, remembering the way his stomach tightened when the police arrived, the way Karen's words made him feel invisible. But he also remembered the way his mom stood tall, the way she looked at him with pride, and how her words changed everything. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table together, Jamal asked, "Mom, do you think it'll ever stop? People looking at me like I don't belong." Alicia reached across the table and held his hand. "I can't promise it will stop completely," she said honestly. "But I can promise you this: you are not alone. And every time we stand up for the truth, every time we remind people of what's right, we move closer to a world where it happens less and less." Her honesty comforted him more than false promises ever could. As weeks passed, the incident faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered. Some neighbors who had watched that day reached out quietly to apologize to Jamal, saying they wished they had spoken up sooner. A few even came to Alicia, admitting that they had learned something important about their own assumptions. Karen, who had once been so certain of her actions, found herself reflecting deeply. She avoided attention, but privately, she struggled with guilt. The image of the governor's calm words, "safe from what?" echoed in her mind. She realized she had seen a child and immediately assumed the worst, and that realization changed the way she looked at the world. For Jamal, life moved forward. He grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. Basketball still filled his afternoons, homework still filled his evenings, but the lessons from that day shaped him in quiet ways. He carried himself a little taller, knowing that even in moments when he felt powerless, his voice mattered, and if his voice was not heard, his mother's would be. Years later, he would look back on that day not only with the memory of fear but also with the memory of resilience. He would remember the way the neighborhood held its breath, the way his mother's presence turned silence into truth, and the way a single misunderstanding became a lesson for an entire community. The story of that afternoon was retold many times, not just as a tale of conflict but as a reminder of awareness, dignity, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are. And though Jamal had never asked to be at the center of such a moment, he understood that it had given him something valuable, the strength to believe in himself, no matter how others saw him. As for Alicia, she knew her work as governor was far from finished. But at home, when she looked at her son, she knew she had already done something even more important. She had shown him, and the world, that truth and courage can stand tall in the face of fear, and that even the smallest voice deserves to be heard. And so, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but the echoes of that day remained. They lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, they lingered in the words of those who retold it, and most of all, they lingered in the quiet strength of a boy who had learned that his worth could never be defined by someone else's suspicion.